Let's come exactly back. We left off at the break and now returning so that the break is a hiatus that does not interfere with the cascade of presentation. That can be done. That's in the high Dharma. It doesn't need a punctuation in phenomenality because it transcends. It's able to go in and out spontaneously from the zero field and the infinite field. Edith Turner and her husband Victor in Zambia with the Ndembu, talking about, writing about, and publishing in Chicago. Victor Turner was a professor of anthropology at the time at the University of Chicago. And his wife Edith was involved in the University of Chicago as well. The crisis of affliction. One of Victor Turner's most famous books is The Drums of Affliction. That for the Ndembu, being haunted during your waking life is usually happening to a woman in the tribe. And what happens is, briefly in a few sentences described, the afflicting spirit is believed to be that of a deceased member of the cult, of those who have gone through this before themselves. The adepts or doctors collect vegetable medicines for the patient, adorn themselves in a special way, and then wash the patient with pounded leaf medicines and give her medicine to drink mixed with water. A shrine is made for the patient near the door of her hut, and cult members perform a number of rites in connection with it. Both men and women may act as doctors for men who were themselves members of a pair of twins, who were sons or fathers of twins, or whose wives, mothers, or sisters have been successfully treated by the Wubangu procedure, have the right to learn the medicines and techniques of Wubangu. According to my records, the afflicting spirit is always that of a woman. And in the majority of cases, it is believed to be the patient's own mother's mother. One of the great collections of work of Victor Turner, published by Cornell University Press. Before he was at the University of Chicago, he was at Cornell. He was there about the same time that Carl Sagan was there. Dramas, Fields, and Metaphors, subtitled Symbolic Action in Human Society. Their first book on the Ndembu, the book that brought them into international repute, was The Forest of Symbols, the jungles of Zambia in the Ndembu, because it was characteristic of that primordial cultural inheritance of all Homo sapiens sapiens. There is something in the haunting by day that is not curable by doing a dream interpretation alone. The affliction is an affliction of being awake in an impaired cultural milieu, to use the French term. Like 2014 all over the world, all over the planet. It is afflicted. Largely by a feminine spirit that is disquieted. not her, not her mother. It is the grandmother generation that is disquieted. Needs to be healed. Edith Turner herself went through that experience. And her book, Experiencing Ritual, A New Interpretation of African Healing. In the introduction, when anthropologists do field work, they try to participate in the life of the people they are studying, but there appear to be limits. Geertz wrote, that's Clifford Geertz, another great symbolic anthropologist, very, very famous, "We cannot live other people's lives. And it is a piece of bad faith to try. We can but listen to what, in words, they say about their lives. We gain our sense of other people's lives through their expressions. It's all a matter of scratching surfaces." And Edith Turner writes, this is partly true. Indeed, it would be valuable if we possessed their memories, if we had the same personal background in the culture. We do not have that background. But there are times when an ethnographer involved in an event of ultimate concern to the subjects of her work goes deeply into an experience herself. Not their self, herself. She went into the drums of affliction herself in the Ndembu village in Zambia, in Africa, personally. Such an event is the focus of this book, a moment when I actually saw a spirit manifestation. And this was first published in 1992, 9 years after Victor prematurely passed away because of cancer. Reprinted here in a new edition by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 1998. It is the wise women who were alive in the late 20th and even into the early 21st century, who experienced the disquiet of the spirits of their grandmother's generation, that as one leaps back some 25 or 30 years for a generation, leaps back about 50 or 60 years. And that the drums of affliction, especially of not only a world that has cultures, but a world that is revved up into civilization forms. Not just civilizations plural, but civilization is a complex spectrum of varieties and kinds, but as a social writ large, not phenomenon alone, but actuality. So that it takes a very high dharma physician, indeed, to be able not only to diagnose correctly, so that the affliction is resolved to the extent that health resonates again, and that the harmonic of the people is restored. very grandiose, essential, necessary. What we're looking at, especially, is the difficulty of understanding that there is a deep crying out affliction need on a world level for a distillation of the world to transform out of a world into a planet in a star system. And that this star system shares unmarked boundaries that nevertheless have contours that can be analyzed. And those contours can even bear names. That we are, by 2014, coming for the first time, a contact with and a penetration through, in a very special way, into the interstellar medium. What occurs in terms of time is that a massive time form has recently transformed, has distilled yet again with an increased dynamic of time. It's not just that time is speeding up, it is massively occurring. And that always in this particular overarching, undercurrent, challenging way, a wave, an energy wave, a time form wave. We've called it a carrier wave. And in the physics of waves, there are certainly massive waves that we recognize occur in sets. Some huge shift, like a massive earthquake from tectonic plate movements, will create a tsunami. There are cultural platelets in civilization that have tectonics as well. And as they move, they produce a tsunami in time energy. And just as a carrier wave is the most massive wave, it's in a set of other waves. A tsunami is usually in a set of about 9 waves. It's usually the center. 4 waves to build up the tsunami, 4 waves to taper down. But not only does a character wave have that quality, but in between carrier waves, at a pivot, there is a reference point in history called a millennium, because the distance in time between carrier waves is 2,000 years, and so every 1,000 years, like a clockwork of calendrical massiveness, 1,000 years. It's universal. When the crisis came of the Tang Dynasty at its brightest, always seems to occur right at its brightest moment. The 2 greatest poets who were friends knew each other in Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty. The grandson of the founder of the Tang Dynasty, Tang Tai-tsung, Xuanzong, and his beautiful concubine, love of his life, they had become a snag so that Yang Kuai-fei and Xuan Zeng engendered an opposition of the military power of their own dynasty. And one of the powerful generals who had an enormous amount of military power had warned them. And finally, General An Lushan unleashed his military might against his very own dynasty. It was the biggest massacre in Chinese history. The population of China at the time of the An Lushan rebellion, as they politely style it, was about 51 million people. In a couple of years, 17 million Chinese were dead. A third of the population, at the high point of excellence of the most famous dynasty in China. And the two greatest poets, Li Po and Tu Fu, were exiled to the opposite ends of the Tang Dynasty kingdom. Li Po was sent to the jungles of what is today Indochina in the south, and Tu Fu was exiled to the cold, barren plains of the north, not just Manchuria, which is above North Korea, up by the Amur River in No Land in Siberia. And Tu Fu had two dreams, each one producing a poem in successive nights. Meng Li Bo, dreaming of Li Po. And he sees the moonlight coming in, and there's a presence of Li Po. And the poet Tu Fu wonders, does this mean that you have died? That I feel you so strongly? The man with 1,000-year name, a millennial, not only millennial, but even beyond name, because his family name was Li. Tang Taizong's family name was Li. His real name was Li Shimin. Shimin Li. Li Po. And they traced their family's ancestry back to Li who was Lao Tzu. They were in the family of the origin of Taoism. Of course, we're splendid now. We deserve to be splendid. We live at this crisis of affliction now, 2015. It is a classic bout of fever of civilization. Because a carrier wave, it crested in its time dynamic in 1991, but was prepared all the way for almost 100 years. One can date the first wave that was significant, 1895. H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, no less. The discovery of the electron, the first subatomic particle. The discovery of X-rays, the first kinds of energy that penetrate matter very, very easily and show structure. X-ray style. It is incredible because in those mid-1890s, the whole structure of certainty became cracked in such a way that the whole of the 19th century prepared it. It became cracked because even the structure of the elements showed that they fractionate electrons out of atoms. My God. X-rays out of energy off the charts that we thought were open. A novel that began the real science fiction vision that the whole of mankind, some 800 years into the future, 800,000 years into the future, would be split, polarized, between the happy-go-lucky teenagers become 20-somethings that when they were about 30, they were called away by an underground, self-exiled group, that the Eloi became the food of the Morlocks. And they would sound the air raid sirens, and out of those air raid sirens, those of a certain susceptibility would voluntarily go into what had been the closed doors of some incredibly ancient, iconic temple. And they would go in, the doors would close, and those in would become the food source of the regressed, monstrous Morlocks. It bothered H.G. Wells the rest of his life. And half a century later, in 1946, his very last book, it's about 80 pages, 90 pages, The Mind at the End of Its Tether. Because he had lived to see, the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and realized that with nuclear bombs, the entire raison d'etre of the civilization structure was gone, fractured forever. It will never be the same again. We're looking at the way in which when this kind of preparation for a carrier wave occurs, what takes real importance for the patience and stability is that the reference wave be understood. But our reference wave, going back to about 1650, was the beginnings of the mathematization of language, and how few people ever, until quite far into the 20th century, were able to understand the calculus of the infinitesimal specificities between 0 and 1 and 1 and 0. The integral calculus, the differential calculus. The way in which one, in order to be real, needed to characterize the entire spectrum of not only just the complexity of the integrals. The International Handbook of Integral Equations is a very thick volume. But the volume on differential and partial differential equations is much thicker, almost twice, maybe almost even more thicker, times thicker. It is imperative but impossible to understand nature in its complexity, but it is not even within the realm of feasibility even to imagine the affliction on the dimensions of consciousness without there being physicians of civilization to come not to the rescue, but to the healing. One of the great figures to understand that it is the 1,000-year period, like Tu Fu calling out to Li Po Yu who have a name of 1,000 years, how important you are, what has happened to you in the shredding of everything that we have understood or could understand. A millennium carries an apocalyptic tone, so that the apocalyptic spirituality, this is a volume that was published by the Paulus Press in New York, of all places that it should be, a library of great spiritual masters. And its preface is by Marjorie Reeves, and the very most important part of this is part 3, Joachim of Fiora, because it is her work on Joachim of Fiora, that her pioneering work, that discovered what is the tie between millennia and apocalypse. And her literally earth-shaking, horn-peeping, interference volume, The Influence of Prophecy in the Later Middle Ages, a study in Joachimism, Oxford at the Clarendon Press. Year of publication, originally 1969. Right at the same time that so many things that we're presenting, that the moon walking is man transcending physically, phenomenally, personally, the earth. And how that went on in an increasing cascade of capability. In just 3 years, from Apollo 11 to Apollo 17, in those 3 years, you had man taking a step on the moon, Armstrong and Aldridge making a few steps with the impress of their boots around their little Eagle capsule. The later Apollo missions had a lunar rover that they could drive. In Apollo 17, Eugene Cernan and Jack Schmitt drove for many miles across the surface of the moon in 1972. Cernan's book is Last Man on the Moon. Why is it that we have not been back to the moon for almost half a century? Because we have been shackled, stymied, prevented, sabotaged, not allowed by an affliction on the very science and technology, on the very history, on the very persons, art of persons, on the very vision. So that the entire ecology of consciousness is itself victimized. So that what happens is that the energy backs up, the energy dynamics of time in civilization backs up and overfloods its reference wave and goes back to the last time that there was a dike, a dam. The previous reference wave. The previous reference wave is 1,000 years earlier. 1650, 650 AD. Well, what in the world happened in 650 AD? The rise of dynastic China, the rise of Islam, the rise of many other concomitant events. What's happening in the 21st century? is not just that the chickens are coming home to roost. The foxes and the wolves are roaming freely. Because that reference wave is not a reference wave for a carrier wave. It's a reference wave for a millennia. And in the millennia, the hearkening goes back to the last carrier wave, the last quality of the carrier wave to make itself meaningful. And the very last quality of that previous carrier wave was, oddly enough, about 95 AD. The power at the time was the Roman Empire. The emperor at the time was a very forceful, youngish tyrant named Domitian. He had arranged to have his older brother Titus poisoned and murdered after only being Roman emperor for 2 years. They were both sons of Vespasian, who founded the Flavian dynasty that succeeded because the crippling corruption, dissolving of the Caesar era of founding the Roman Empire had dissolved so that it was not workable ever again. Unless there was some new power group that came in to claim it, which Vespasian did. Not that he claimed it, but he was acclaimed it by the military again. And where was he acclaimed? In Alexandria. When was he acclaimed? In 69 AD. And what was happening in Alexandria in 69 AD? St. John had just written his gospel. It's in the New Testament, the gospel according to John. And was leaving Alexandria to go back to Ephesus, where he had been raised for a long time. His tutor there for over 20 years was Mary Magdalene herself. He understood very well. He knew all the people involved personally. The way that the military proved that Vespasian had the power that they were giving him was they took 2 miracles out of early Christianity. That Jesus was a miracle worker who could make the lame walk and the blind see. And part of their acclamation of him was that Vespasian had healed a crippled person so that the lame walk again, and had taken some of his spittle and mixed it with Egyptian Alexandrian dust and put it on the eyes of a blind person and they could see. And because he could make the lame walk and the blind see, he could bring the Roman Empire into a whole new dynastic. It was just the fall of the dynasty, not the fall of the empire. Just like in the Tang. Just like all of dynastic China. Whenever a dynasty would fall, new dynasty. We're the new, they're the old. They failed, we succeed. Succession is success, isn't it? Power. The whole quality has a sociological analytic that is profound. And not only the anthropology of the Turners and many others, Clifford Geertz, etc., but the sociology especially of a Canadian who was born in 1922 in southern Alberta. His name was Irving Goffman. Goffman's parents were Jewish. They were Jewish Ukrainians. They were immigrants to Canada early in the 20th century to get away from the 1917 revolution of the Bolsheviks. There are a lot of, I taught and lived for 5 years in Calgary in southern Alberta. I know very well. One of the Russian immigrant groups was the Doukhobors, who chose Tolstoy as their model, not Lenin. And so left and set up Tolstoyan utopian communities in southern British Columbia and parts of southern Alberta, where before that in southern Alberta there were millennial fundamentalist groups that had settled and made communities as well. Goffman, his family moved from Alberta across the great Canadian prairies to Winnipeg. And in 1937, he began going to high school in Winnipeg, the big city. It has about half the population of Manitoba. It's the only big city, really, that's viable there, really large place. About 800,000 people now, maybe more. He began to understand that there is a lot to know about the social groups and the situation, and eventually he would go to Ottawa after getting to Toronto to get a degree, a bachelor's degree. The University of Toronto, very, very excellent place, very high quality scholarship. And went to Ottawa because it was the beginning of the Second World War settling in, early 1940s, 41. And he began to work in Ottawa for the agencies that were helping Canadians help the war effort. And eventually, Goffman began to understand that he needed to go back to his education. And he finally went back after World War II was over, and he entered into the experience that changed most of his life. When you look at his whole education, graduating in 1945 with a BA in sociology and anthropology, later moved to the University of Chicago, where he received an MA in 1949 and PhD in 1953 in sociology. He was at the University of Chicago at the same time that the Turners were there, and many other persons. And one of the qualities of the University of Chicago at that time was that it had now a couple of generations of the excellence of, they used to call Chicago the city of the big shoulders. Not a culturally refined city like Boston or a power city like New York or a great heritage city like Philadelphia. Chicago had been rebuilt from a massive fire that had destroyed most of the center of Chicago right after the Civil War. And in rebuilding it, they rebuilt it so that it would be the focus and hub of a whole new distribution of wealth and energy of the railroads of the United States, including a lot in Canada, so that Chicago became the hub of the railroad industrial power of America. And when we come back next week, we'll take a look at the way in which Goffman's first book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. This is the original North American printing, Anchor Books, original, 1959. I bought a copy like this at the University of Wisconsin in 1959. But it was published in 1956 at the University of Edinburgh as an academic monograph. It was the beginning of the way in which he would eventually produce a whole raft of works. One of the most famous is on framing. This one encounters two studies in the sociology of interaction. Was published in 1961, and it has two sections. It has two parts. It has a polarity. Part one is fun in games, and part two is role distance. If you know the network of roles in the game, you can encounter success. Can you? Next week.